remaining part so I can hand it over to you, Walt.
Okay, perfect.
Hopefully you are here for the new insights into engagement research and practices, expanding our toolbox. You have passed the first test of getting here, so good job. Want to make sure real fast that we do thank our platinum sponsors, University of Idaho and Washington State University Extension. And you can see you can do a NACDEP 21, tweet them. Our bronze sponsors, I'm sure you've heard them at many of these sessions, so please take a gander. Some of these universities you're probably related to. We appreciate all of their support. And since we are already a little behind schedule, I am going to hand it over to Walt. Please remember, same Zoom etiquette. Keep yourself muted until questions at the end. If you have a dying question you don't want to forget, put it in the chat box.
Great. Thanks,
Okay.
Adina. Thank you.
You are welcome. It's all yours.
Appreciate it. Let me share my screen and we will get running here. I'm assuming you can see that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the glitches, wherever they came from, the gremlins that got us. As Adina said, we're just really about some new insights in engagement, research, and practice that we've been working on as part of a 4-year effort. I'll have a bit more to say about that in a minute. It sort of explores these things in more detail and is in a structured kind of way. Joining me today will be Cheryl Buckhart-Kriesel from University of Nebraska at Lincoln and Wes Eaton from here at Penn State as well. But we also stand on the shoulders of lots of other folks, including the 3 that you can see there, Elizabeth Engel, Kathy Brazier, and Jason Weigel. Jason used to work for University of Nebraska-Lincoln and has now moved on, but has been an integral part of this team. So there's a lot. In fact, the whole team across all 5 states is about 30 people. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that. But this work, as you can see across the bottom of this slide, is a multi-university kind of event. University of Lincoln, Nebraska, ARS, Arizona State, Penn State, and we are funded by USDA NEFA. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second too. So there's lots to talk about here. And some of this may seem a little bit, some of this will be familiar with many of you. Some of this will be new, I hope, but I hope one of the things that you'll all take away from this is sort of the benefit of how we've structured this and how we're understanding this, how we employed this, and those kinds of things. Oh, and I should mention, just sort of in a housekeeping sort of realm, we'll have a couple of places throughout these sections. We're going to take each of these sections one at a time, and we'll have some opportunity to weigh in specifically around those kind of topics. But if you have other ideas, other questions, please put them in the chat. We'll address them as they arise if they're critically important at that time, but we'll also have time at the end for some discussion as well. So we'll talk a little bit about project background, dive a little bit into the systematic literature review that we've done, the conceptual framework and study design. Wes will take care of both 2 and 3 in this list. Then Cheryl and I will pick up on some key adaptive engagement concepts and lessons we've learned. Then we'll talk a little bit about the engagement guidebook that we're putting together that we hope you can weigh in on a bit as well. So what sort of motivates us? What gets us up in the morning? You all, I think, are keenly aware that stakeholder engagement, and particularly in natural resources, but lots of issues, has lots of opportunity and lots of supposed benefits. They're not supposed, they're real, but we often assume they have all sorts of benefits and reasons for why we do them. Bringing together, you can see some of those there, sharing views, learning together, coordinating action. We want better outcomes. Do they lead to better outcomes? Do they lead to more voice and empowerment? But the entire purpose behind our effort has been little empirical evidence to support many pieces of those assumptions. So our job has really been to dive into the science of engagement and look at that black box of what happens. And here's a quick little cartoon many of you may have seen. On the left-hand side is the inputs, and on the right-hand side is the outputs, and then a miracle occurs. And obviously, we need to be as specific as possible in step 2. In a very real way, this is where we are. This was the purpose of our job. So as I mentioned, this is USDA NEFA 4-year project, multidisciplinary, multi-institution, and in a broad sort of context, our efforts facilitated community-led stakeholder engagement that addressed water and ag issues. We'll have more to say about that. Matters that in issues that mattered to them most. Then our job was to support, and our process model was to support local initiatives, including support from biophysical and social scientists, and then study what changed because of these interventions, because of engagement. At the individual level, and Wes will have a lot more to say about this in a few minutes, the individual level, the group level, the community level, and at the environmental level. So really as robust way as we could in terms of using engagement as sort of the intervention and looking at a whole range of factors that occurred or resulted because of that implementation. Here's our 5 sites. We had 2 sites in Pennsylvania and Nebraska, 2 sites in Pennsylvania, 2 sites in Nebraska, and 1 in Arizona. I'll have a picture of those in a second. But essentially what our intervention, for lack of a better description, was to facilitate a modified strategic planning process, many of the components of which will seem familiar to many of you. We packaged them together in a way that we could effectively study cause and effect and all sorts of theory of change kind of things and all those kind of things. And this next slide will identify a couple of these things more, identifying issues, existing approaches, really a mixed methods of studying, mixed method approach of studying engagement, and then really a robust support structure from both social and biophysical researchers and scientists and experts from all of our partner institutions. And here are those 5 sites. We sort of selected them in many ways to be different and diverse in terms of agriculture, policies, practices, regulations, commodities, all of those kinds of things. So really what we were building towards was a consistent model in diverse contexts that we could study. And our sort of a broad picture of our stroke of what we were looking at built into this process model. And the next slide will help you understand this better. But we really put a premium on these processes across all 5 sites that focused on building relationships and trust, incorporating views of multiple stakeholders, fostering reciprocity, and co-creating knowledge and co-creating learning. Then proactively identifying issues, developing common frames, engagement plans. You can see this list. I'm not going to read it all. This next slide will sort of illuminate a little bit of that, I hope. And remember, this is over 24 months or so. A couple of our sites are still going. A couple of sites have had commencement, and now are working sort of beyond the scope of the original intent of the project. So initiation, bringing these groups together, these diverse stakeholders in a leadership team environment, walking through you can see the principles and the highlights here. Transparency, developing collaborative expectations. Then sort of an in-depth situational assessment. where we're looking at current and past programs, performances, research, effectiveness, partners, all of those kinds of things. Then building to identification of issues. And you can see that list, including and importantly, developing engagement and communication plans around each of those components, then implementation, and then evaluation and assessment. Many of these things are familiar to many of you, but putting them together in this way, it built on each component, allowed us to do some of those things that I talked about in the previous slide and that are highlighted really here. Building that trust, building those relationships in a community-led context. The one thing that's important to understand here is this was water and agriculture, but we did not predefine the issues whatsoever that these communities and these groups would undertake. That emerged from their discussions, their current analysis, those relationships, those kinds of things. Purposely acknowledge co-creation and reciprocity, like I spoke to a second ago. Probably the best way for us that we've thought about to capture this is through all 5 sites, we adhered to these process goals, the working principles, and evaluation and the research methods and metrics. But what we did was allow for as much adaptive and responsive flexibility as we could, given local priorities, needs, conditions, circumstances. All of these sites had very different past experiences with engagement, had very different environmental concerns or considerations, or regulatory concerns or considerations, commodity concerns, water concerns, those kind of things. So what we're trying to do is establish a consistent and coherent approach, yet was still reflective of the groups, that put a premium on maximum responsiveness from and with all of our partner groups. And here's just a list of some of the things that came out of those groups. I'm not going to go into any detail here. I can, if you're interested, we can talk about some of these, but all of these sort of emerged from that 2-year process across these sites. And now I'd like to take just a quick thing, and I'm hoping this is going to work in our link actually. And let me also put this in. If it doesn't work for you directly from here, I'm going to put this in the chat pod if I can. This question is also in the chat pod. This is going to be a quick sort of word cloud that if everything in the way tech went today, I'm not entirely sure. But if you click on that link in the chat box, you'll be asked for up to three of your greatest challenges regarding stakeholder engagement in your work. Yes.
It's not showing up in the chat box.
It's not in the chat box.
No.
You might have to hit enter.
It's in my chat box. What the heck is going on? And
hit the return key.
Yeah, I was. See, and it goes to everyone. You can't see that.
We have really good gremlins. Ah, there it is. Okay, somebody put it in there.
Okay, maybe it's just a delay. I put it in twice, so maybe the second time came through. So if you click on that link, you should be directly into a few text boxes that allow you to highlight some of your greatest challenges related to stakeholder engagement. And what this will do will give us a word cloud to work from. So just take a couple of minutes to do that. If you have troubles, just give me a shout. Take about maybe another half a minute or so. Okay, let's see what we got here. Can you see that or no?
No.
All right. That was, my apologies all. Let me do one thing. Never done it with this bigger group, so that's part of what's challenging me.
Basically, what you could do is, do you have your Menti screen open?
Yeah,
Can you go to your Menti screen on your browser?
yeah,
Because you can see it. You can pull it up by that.
yeah, I can see it, but I can't get it to so you guys can see it.
So you have to stop sharing screen
On the
and then
share
share your-
screen, you need to select that shared screen.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
click
Right.
your up arrow on shared screen and it should show you all
Mhm.
the screens you have open and you just need to select that one.
Yeah. Mhm.
There you go.
There's an idea. When I did this in real life, it worked, but it was just me.
Right.
There
Okay.
you go.
Cool.
There you go.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So you can see the list we have here.
Yes.
Participation obviously being the huge and first one. I'm assuming that for the most of us, that means gathering participation, getting participation, keeping participation, those kinds of things. Time, the right stakeholders, attendance, follow through, facilitation skills, all of those kinds of things. The right people, it's an important one, and that we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Survey fatigue, synthesizing results. This is great. This is wonderful. Messaging, turnover, getting to them, reaching them. That's a great list. When I put all this together and send all these slides out to everyone, I will include this. Does any of that surprise you while we're here?
No, not at all.
Sadly. But it's interesting. I'm surprised. I'm a little bit surprised that some things didn't get bigger than others, because we often share a lot of common issues when we're dealing with this stuff. Anyhow, I will stop this share, and I want to get back to this so that Wes can take over from here. And He's going to talk about the literature review, the systematic literature review that we undertook. Let me get back to there, Wes, and it's all yours.
Hi,
There you go.
everyone. It's so nice to be welcome to your professional conference. I know Walt's been a longtime member. I'm a sociologist. I'm at Penn State, and I work with Cheryl and Walt on this Water for Ag project. And I've been part of the socio-behavioral research team on the project. And I'm going to talk about a few of the things we've been doing. One of them is the systematic review of the literature. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the conceptual framework we've put together for a theory of change through stakeholder engagement, and then our research design for how we're trying to evaluate or capture data on that. So let me start with a systematic review. Basically, when we started the project, Walt and I are hanging out together, and we're hanging out with Cheryl. This is pre-pandemic, and everyone's throwing this word engagement around. But what do we mean by that? So we can put that question to the literature: what is stakeholder engagement? There's a lot of interest in public participation and stakeholder engagement in natural resource management. So we wanted to look and inform our project with what's there. We immediately noticed two gaps. One is that most of the work across a range of disciplines that use these words is using single case studies or just some comparative case studies. And so there's a lot of opportunity for more systematic comparative analysis, both in new research and in a review of what's out there. And then a second thing we notice is that for the systematic reviews that are out there, and that means in organized fashion, going over the published literature in scholarly academic articles, it seems to be focused on particular concepts. So terms you're all familiar with, like participation, or particular outcomes like social learning. So there's an opportunity to look more more systematically at a more complex picture of change to engagement, not just on narrow particular outcomes. Well, you're going to have to advance for me, I think. Okay. So the questions we wanted to put to research thus far, published across a range of journals that relate to natural resource and environmental management, is how is engagement and stakeholder defined or theorized? What strategies and also modes or processes that puts engagement into action? And then this is particularly important for our conceptual framework. What are the observed or documented outcomes, and how are they documented? And how do they relate to the context and process and other factors that enable or constrain those types of outcomes? So in other words, what do we know about that? And how are engagement practices evaluated or assessed? So this particular set of slides is limited. We've expanded this literature review beyond this, but what we're going to talk about today is 206 peer-reviewed articles out of hundreds that we started with that actually met our qualifications for what we're looking for. The majority of these are these singular comparative case studies, and we focus in on articles that look at outcomes or processes related to participation or stakeholder engagement, or theoretical concepts or particular empirical methods. So that's how we developed our pool of articles we're going to query for our research questions. What's nice about this picture is it shows growing amount of interest as reflected in published scholarly articles, starting from 2000 to I think our more recent data is now 2018, but with this slide up to 2017. Here's another Mentimeter word cloud about underneath the headings of engagement and stakeholder engagement, how it's talked about in the words. And you can see public participation there, and stakeholder engagement and collaboration, and then a range of other concepts. I think this also reflects the disciplinary silos under which this kind of work is packaged. And while it's not accounted here as a finding, I do notice that the divide across publications and outputs related to practice and publication outputs related to particular disciplinary questions, like be it agricultural economics, be it sociology or geography. And I think that helps explain the diverse, smaller keywords we're seeing here across the research. Another figure here that shows what how our stakeholders talked about in this sample of literature. These are all groups folks here are familiar with, but this is how it pools out in the literature. Biggest stakeholder being government right now. One of the findings we're working on as we continue to code articles right now is setting the research we found next to the IAP2 continuum for engagement, from informing to empower. And that we noticed across the literature, the word engagement or participation is thrown around. Of course, we can define it across this wide span, but often in practice and the published literature on stakeholder engagement, it describes things more to the left end than the right end of the spectrum. I don't think that would really surprise too many folks, but to find this and empirically documented in the literature was interesting. Some more of our preliminary results in terms of what are the outcomes, and then what are facilitating or enabling factors or conditions, and what are constraining factors or conditions for those outcomes. And under the left-hand box for outcomes, you can see you have social change, you have behavioral change, and then you have more technical or practical outcomes, forming new groups or change in existing groups, plans and policies. And the range of conditions that facilitate this, that resonate with what we're going to be talking about today is this having a transparent process, adapting and being sensitive to the contextual setting, pre-existing levels of trust or conflict within a particular place, having capacity to do this. Folks here in this room have done work on leadership and facilitation, and then the longevity, sustained practice. Constraining, here this would overlap with the word cloud you folks did with Walt a minute ago. Well, an interesting one would be having natural resource dependency in itself would be constraining on the kind of engagement that we're looking at for outcomes in terms of change. And let's see, disciplinary conflicts right across doing transdisciplinary work, overly technical that leads to siloing, and then itself having a lack of evaluated criteria would be constraining for knowing outcomes. So we also wanted to know how is stakeholder engagement being studied? How is data being collected? This preliminary review talks about what we're doing. They do interviews with stakeholders, community surveys, participant observations, document analysis, and personal experience of authors. That last bullet point comes through quite a bit as kind of subjective of their experience based on their gap that we're going to talk about in a minute here is a need for looking, revisiting this data over time, looking longitudinally at change. So what we're working towards arguing in this paper with the systematic review is there's this need for social theory building. Okay, and why do that? Well, without a theory of engagement, arguably there's not a barometer to know whether or not we're moving the needle. There's this need for more longitudinal analysis for looking at change through this experience over time versus just immediate snapshot views. There's the literature calls for, and the gaps call for, this more explicit tackling of power dynamics. This perhaps relates to some of the challenges we all have in getting stakeholder participation as those existing power dynamics throughout also the process of working together. More interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research as opposed to single silo research with and for engagement, And then calling for exploring further on the right end. Where's the work on empowering, and where's the work that's explicitly community driven, and things like that. So wanted to just take a second here to get some brief feedback from folks. Any thoughts on this first go at kind of this comprehensive review of the literature? Anything useful here with your work, or any things you'd like to see added or pushed on or explored further?
And you can either put stuff in the chat or just open your mic and join us.
I think one of the comments I was going to put in the word cloud was that notion around how do you translate the knowledge that you're receiving from your stakeholders to action. And so that last point that you had on your slide, I think Weston and Walt was kind of speaking to that, you know, that empowerment piece. I feel like sometimes that takes more time to do, and it can look different from place to place, you know. So it's not necessarily, you know, it's going to look the same, or depending on the dynamics, some it could be the power dynamics, or maybe the issue that you're trying to address, or even your stakeholders that you're involving. So I definitely agree with you that that's the area that normally sticks out to me when I'm looking at some of this work.
Yeah, for me as well. And Juliet entered in the chat. She was excited to see this. Lots of potential to share some of what we find with community leaders as they think about understanding the value of engagement. And that is spot on, Juliet. It's one of the things that has sort of been motivating us along the way. And Neil noted he was surprised there isn't more research related to this issue.
Again, this systematic review was related to natural resource management in particular.
Right. So writ large, there is more, but it's from what we've been able to tell, correct me, Wes, otherwise, many of those same themes hold across all sorts of other sort of areas of engagement, practice, and study. And speaking of engagement and study, wait a minute, I missed Colette's. I'd like to know how engagement affects local power influences with decision-making, especially with final decisions. And when water is involved, my experience, many people feel powerless. Those are all absolutely true. We'll get a little bit of flavor, a little bit more discussion relative to the power dynamics here in just a few minutes. But for the sake of catching us up on time a little bit, I think we'll move on. And speaking of studying engagement, Wes, you want to jump in here again and talk a little bit about this? And this is, I have to say, Wes, he's the central brain power behind a whole lot of this stuff, a scholar extraordinaire. So this is fascinating to me. I've been doing engagement for a long time, but our structured approach to this is just has been really, really beneficial to think through and to think through our practice of.
Okay, so yeah, this is our conceptual framework. So we write this grant to the USDA and we say, you know, we want to study stakeholder engagement, and we can't exactly put our fingers on what engagement yet is, and we can't exactly put our fingers exactly on how this process is going to work. But we eagerly started building this as the project got started with our systematic literature review, and this represents what we uncovered as both knowledge gaps across the literature, but also the main accepted concepts within stakeholder engagement. So as a theory of change, which is reflected here in this model, external and external contextual factors, local conditions and things. Oh, you can go back. Well, I'll put it together.
Okay, all right. Yep.
And the process itself, the design features of the process, enable and constrain different kinds of outcomes that we'll talk about today. And the trick for us was, how do we come up with those key concepts that reflect across this, that we can then collect data on in a participatory fashion that is being done not just to extract data from communities for some ivory tower purpose, but done in a way that's empowering and supportive of the process, which puts the researchers in an interesting position of being both observer, objective scientist observer, while also working directly with stakeholders on a process we want to see succeed. You can see our research question there. Okay, thanks, Walt. Okay, so let's unpack some of these briefly. Literature on organizational change and other theories of change through social interaction talks about external and internal context. So external context are the big, broad things that are out of the hands of stakeholders, conveners, and participants. Technology change, policy changes, and the environments within which those things are. Those factors are certainly important on what's able to happen or not with an engagement process. Certainly back to the idea of who's going to make the final decision, and is it something that's internal or external to the group? Okay, and then you have the internal context. These are things that are part of the culture of the place and of the group, and that are shaped by people who would participate in an engagement process. And again, back with what Walt said earlier about us forming these groups for this process, our theory of engagement here is that we're bringing diverse stakeholders together that all represent individual groups they're part of, to form this new working group for a period of time. So we're looking at change both within and outside of that group. Ansel and Gash's 3 points there are on the bottom. The relationships that are between groups already in the community will certainly shape what's able to happen with the facilitated engagement process. As will the individual characteristics of the people. I saw that on the Mentimeter that you folks put together. One useful way that we thought about doing this is adult learning theory, Knoll's principles of adult education. The extent to which individuals are open to learning and willing to learn, and that's different stages of life that allows for that. Because if we're interested in change, and AKA a theory of learning through social interaction, those are good baseline conditions to capture, to make sense of the extent to which the process had an impact. Well, we have to ask, was there openness or opportunity for that to happen in order to give any attribution of change to the process itself? Process design features. Folks here in the room, this is your bread and butter. One way to break this down is Habermas's communicative discourse theory, which underlies all this, that changing and sharing ideas can lead to shared understanding. We from this drew out factors or indicators that go into these buckets of the deliberative context, deliberation itself, and then uniting or having some shared understanding, which in theory can enable collective action. Go ahead, Walt. I just want to highlight a couple of these here. These are factors that we're interested in studying, and then had, as Walt likes to say, baked into the process itself across our 5 sites. When we're sharing this, and there's this push to involve diverse stakeholders, diverse in terms of backgrounds, diverse in terms of access to power and resources. Why? Why do this? Well, the basis of the theory is that without bringing in diverse, more and less powerful stakeholders, the status quo ways that problems are approached aren't going to be shaken up. Process control. Walt mentioned this off the bat, that what the literature, what it says in theory and what is being conceptualized, and what we're looking for evidence for, is that without a sense of having ownership over the process. Walt emphasized how, while the project's Water for Ag, we brought folks together, but we didn't predetermine the agenda. So if the agenda is not predetermined, the theory then says you have more opportunity for enabling this sense of ownership. I saw someone use the phrase buy-in earlier, developing a set, like, where does a sense of responsibility come for people? Well, it's having the opportunity to have a way of shaping the process. Old hat for folks in this room. Okay, and here's our buckets of outcomes we're looking at. The first one is social learning and community capacity building. I found it interesting that these concepts remain very disparate in the literature. The people talking about capacity building are not talking about learning, and vice versa. We talk about social learning in terms of cognitive change at individual and group levels, change in relationships, trust and forming new relationships and enhancing existing relationships, change in norms, that's the pressure or expectations that drive the decisions we make, and also enhance skills. Capacity building, of course, is theorized through sharing and building capacity to have the resources to enact the things a group envisions. Behavioral change, we're thinking about individuals changing, also the stakeholder group itself making decisions that lead to new action, and also organizational level change. For instance, sharing information, accessing resources, and working in concerted efforts. These are all things we can capture data and are working to do to see if these things happen through and what that means through these processes. Then environmental change, we can think about local environmental change, broader scales of environmental change, and also change in environmental perceptions. So this was really missing through the literature, as relating social change, change in norms, change in behaviors, and to what extent they actually impact on the ground, not just policies or plans, but can we capture data on changes in air quality, water quality, soil quality, biodiversity, other indicators like that, and threading this through. And dealing with the fact that how extremely complex this is, considering all the factors that already are shaping these processes, and we want to understand how engagement has an impact on that.
There we go.
I'll just speak briefly about our approach. It's longitudinal, so we're collecting data at different points in time, and we want to see, get into that part of that black box of when these things happen. We want to see when there are examples of change. Was there hot moments or lag times in between there? We also want to do mixed methods approach. For instance, if we're measuring a concept with self-reported data in individual surveys, how does that pony up to the observations that social scientists are making in the rooms of what happened? And how does that compare with what the facilitators themselves had experienced? So instead of just using a single method at one point in time, also, as we've been talking about since the beginning, we have multiple case sites. So by looking at one case and holding it up against the light of the other, we're hoping to uncover insights that aren't possible without that. And we're using a range of interviews and surveys, participant observations, and then regular formative and summative evaluations with our facilitators, conveners. But the important thing to keep in mind here is we did not want to make participants feel like guinea pigs. We're very cautious of that. So the interviews before and after there's much about relationship building and listening as they are about collecting data. The feedback we're getting through these periodic surveys with folks we try to make it as tight and short and kind of behind the scenes to prioritize that group's focus as we can. So that's a constant challenge and something constantly on the minds in our project is, again, we're not just taking, but how can we bring back our surveys, for instance, that we've done with you on the community on issues, so it empowers and supports the groups and what their goals are and things like that. Okay, a couple more real quick slides here. So what are we finding and what are we producing with all this? So with a academic hat back on, here's the manuscripts that we're really trying to, our top 4 manuscripts we're getting out of this project. First is the paper, it's in Society Natural Resources, forthcoming, that puts together our conceptual framework, theory of change and framework for change through engagement. And the second is the systematic review we talked earlier. We're currently coding, ongoing coding on that, putting that together this summer. Putting together the research design I just briefed about, that's also being put together this summer. And then a series of outcomes papers that looks across the data, looks at the qualitative data, looks at the quantitative data to show what the range of outcomes are. And this slide just has here's the other range of papers we're doing. Case comparisons, interview papers, papers on the mail surveys, papers on our experience with team science, papers on particular concepts. These are dissertations, and these are grad student led and postdoc led and other researcher led project papers. Thank you.
Did I lose you, mate?
No, I'm just gonna take a breath and
No,
let folks share any thoughts they have on the framework, on any experiences you have with collecting this kind of data, and just chat a little bit.
Yep, exactly. So again, either through the chat or just open your mic and share some thoughts or questions or experiences. Does this help you in trying to figure out your own work, or what opportunities or challenges does that create?
I think it will be helpful. One of the things that I am curious about in your process is, like, I'm in northern Idaho in the Panhandle. We're in a dryland ag area, and we currently have a project looking at scaling up local food production, and specifically fruits and vegetables, which would require use of aquifer water, which has been declining since the 60s here. And the main conversation right now is really siloed into water for 2 cities and 2 universities. However, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of other expansion where we have new developments going in. We've done amazing work in water conservation at the household level, but there's nothing that's integrated. Everything is siloed around the conversations for water. And we, through our research project, are trying to design our next food summit, which is an annual event with different themes, looking at land and water to bring the conversation much broader than one of these silos. And so I'm really interested in how to think about engagement in a way that creates outcomes that take away some of the siloing. And I'm wondering if you've seen some of that in the literature or the work that you're doing.
I can speak to the practice, and Wes can speak to the literature. And from a practice perspective, if you remember back to the slides of the process model, one of the ways we got to that point was very purposefully asking about issues, about past programs, about past partnerships, and identifying future kinds of things. So almost by definition, we broadened the tent and were very purposeful, extremely purposeful in a respectful, open, community-led sort of dialogue. And that was sort of our mantra. And by and large, it was very effective at building those relationships and respecting, because everybody comes to this with different expertise and experience and positions and power and all of that sort of thing in a community. And all of that emerged fairly effectively, but I would argue that it did so primarily because we were good at asking the questions, sort of open-ended questions, rather than predetermining or defining intended outcomes. Does that help?
Yeah, that gives me something to think about, because we're really working on how to frame the conversations at our event.
And one of the things and we'll talk about this at the very end, we are pulling together the guidebook to do this. And I think a lot of those components that we're pulling together and the lessons learned and the experiences from that, I think will probably help you.
Great, thank you.
And boundary spanning, exactly. Any other quick thoughts? So there's a couple of other pieces I want to just touch on real quickly, and then I want to get to Cheryl. we're woefully, the late start didn't help us any, to be certain. Couple of concepts we've teased, but I want to just take a couple of seconds to expand on or elaborate on a little bit. Community-led engagement, co-production, knowledge
Trying to get a
co-production.
picture. Hold on.
And you saw that these generally fall within that umbrella of adaptive engagement that we sort of spoke to earlier. Holding these things constant as principles, yet adaptive in the context of the communities in which it occurs. So essentially, we could think about community-led engagement. A lot of things happen from top down, right? An agency will lead an effort or catalyze an effort or those kind of things. Or you can have bottom up. Community-led in our definition and the way we've approached this is really a combination. Obviously, we were the catalysts, but and there's a couple of slides here in a second will help identify or clarify that a little bit. But to the maximum extent possible, we imbued in our groups, our community groups that we worked with, the agency and the authority to guide process, to guide issues, to guide priorities, to guide success metrics, all of those kinds of things. So it's we would argue, a critically important part of this emerging puzzle of engagement that is well worth sort of at least getting to the maximum extent possible, but also recognizing where we are and situating our processes within these kind of concepts and structures. And you can see this, and I don't want to get into a lot of this detail, but you can see sort of, this is set up as a dichotomy, but rather it's a continuum. You can see, I'm sure you'll recognize many of the things in the left-hand column, where government or organization led, it's problem focused, it's hierarchical, it's sort of single dimension, the silos that we just talked about. That should say independent or dependent. But then community led, moving towards this side, is doing what we can to catalyze and incentivize sort of joint decision-making, long-term vision, systematic focus, again, rather than the silo, those kinds of things. And then obviously influence, decision-making, and authority increase as we move from left to right. A couple of aspects of this that we think are important. Obviously, there's benefits. There's capacity building, sustainability, leveraging resources, alignments, and goals. And here's what I sort of already alluded to. When we're thinking about community-led, they, as to the maximum extent possible, they got to choose the issues that matter to them. They got to choose the outcomes that matter to them. We control the process a little bit more than perhaps because, and this is real life, we were essentially the professional facilitators. And of course, we had adherence to our research model. So that was less so of a community-led, although they had plenty of opportunity within that general framework. And then there are opportunities for decision-making, implementation, evaluation, all of those kinds of things were all to the maximum extent driven by them. Some of the lessons we learned along that way is it can be really time-consuming. Some folks in our groups had a hard time. They wanted to go straight, they're used to going straight from subject to getting something done without all that learning and relationship building in the middle, right? And then some folks, there's levels of expertise and comfort vary, power differentials vary, clear attention to attention and trust is central and core to all of this, and it might not be appropriate for all issues or groups. Then a quick little, I want to touch real quickly on this idea of co-production. Many of you are familiar with it, but from our perspective, it has a lot of importance, not only to science, what questions of science, what processes of science we do in partnership with communities, but it also has relevant to practice. What are the tools and strategies that we can use to co-create that knowledge within our groups? It builds upon and goes beyond sort of the sum of the parts. And that's a very specific approach and principle and framework from a facilitation perspective that drove all sorts of things, all sorts of strategies that we employed along the way. I don't want to spend much time here. We can't afford it, but there's really two elements to that: is informing science and informing practice and our approach to those. And then Cheryl, this is you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Walt. So what I'd like you to do is actually just think of an example that you have worked with yourself, where you've been doing a lot of engagement work. And what I would challenge you to do is think about that in terms of some of these lessons learned. So how we came up with those actually is my partner in crime, Jason Weigel, and I went to a cafe, had some wonderful coffee and donuts, and we started just thinking about what happened in our sites. So I worked with the North Platte area in Nebraska. He worked with Central Platte. And so we just started talking about what we saw. And so as in all good NACDEP presentations, you do a divide and conquer, right? So Walt and Wes sort of took the front part of it, and we were given this reflections and lessons learned. So what we started doing is just thinking about what did we see in our sites. So again, with this example in particular, we really had some interesting internal engagement because we had biophysical folks as well as social scientists, and they were coming together on the internal side. So they didn't always see things quite the same. Then on the other side, the external, we had stakeholders that might be agency people, they might be area producers. We had business reps from our community. And so again, there was a lot of engagement and meshing of ideas that needed to kind of take place. So when you think about it, assessing the situation is always important. We talk about environmental scans, a variety of different things, but we had two groups that were really dealing with, the internal one and the external. And sometimes they were both challenging. And so there was engagement on both sides. That continual facilitation, conflict management, and professional development, learning, man, it was going on both levels, at both sides. And so we were always, as facilitators and as the people on the ground working with these groups, we were always, wearing a lot of hats and sometimes taking them off and putting them on as fast as we could. The me to we, it does take time and intentional aspects, and really it's critical into the learning capacity building and trust. And so what we came up with, as a good extension people would, we kind of had to put it into a graphic form so that we could get our arms around it. And I'll do a disclaimer right off the bat. This comes by way of how Jason and I sort of saw what was happening in engagement as we worked with our external groups and also negotiated and worked through with the internal ones. So just starting out here, that personal institutional piece, anytime you bring people together, it's kind of a leap of faith. And this project in particular, as an example, was a hard one to explain because we were working with water issues, but we were also studying them as they worked through water issues. So we're pretty sure our relationships that we had with people helped bring people to the table, as well as our institutional relationships and their past experiences. And we also had the opportunity to kind of push and pull a little bit and bring new people to the table. In particular, we had an opportunity to bring women ag producers and women ag business owners and operators to the table in the session that I was most closely involved in. And that's different. That doesn't happen every day when you're going to be talking about really hardcore water issues. Okay, so those are just a couple of things. Having that trust really was able to, for us to bring people to the table. And then going to the next one, the adaptive engagement process. Adaptive is a key word here. Again, it goes back to that community-led part. We came up with the phrase breaks the mold because some of these folks have been and worked with Extension over the years, and they are, some of them were agency people, and they sort of expected us and Extension and the university to sort of lead them down the path. And it was uncomfortable when we only led so far. We had to have them come up with the projects, or they gave the direction, and that was uncomfortable. And we knew it on our side, we could feel it, and we knew they were feeling it as well. So, but again, we told them this is how it really will benefit the community down the road. And so finally they had to kind of assume that was going to be the case. And so we were adapting, and they were kind of changing and kind of making sure that that was an appropriate role, I guess. This adaptive engagement process, also perfect example is all the COVID changes. Of course, we went from face-to-face to the use of the Zoom. And to be honest, I think by that time we had built up enough trust and confidence that it was not a big deal. It felt like a big deal for us as facilitators, but when we got people together, we got about the same number of people together. We didn't have a lot of fallout. So I think having that trust and trust in the system and what we were doing helped kind of grease the wheels to make that happen. The network and relationship building, again, it's that shared understanding. Participants would really build and leverage relationships. And we've got kind of two really good examples here. One is that in one of the sites, we had a lot of agency reps, and they not always were on the same side when it came to water issues. So in Nebraska, we have this phrase, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. Okay, so we've had a long history of sort of batting our heads at things. So getting these people together and thinking about things in a new way and in a neutral way took a little bit of time, and it was very intentional. Again, that's where that building that and leveraging relationships. In the area that I worked in, there was a picture there, a tunnel collapse. It was a major disaster where water was not available through surface irrigation. And so we were able to leverage a local state senator who was actually the chair of our state appropriations committee to come in and talk to our group and interact with our group as how are we going to work through this issue. So that was a real reach out, and that was a real leverage of relationships. We also, on one location, helped bring in the community foundation. So in terms of the outcomes, again, we go to that co-knowledge part. We were moving from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And also the whole idea that we can do this and we can trust the process. So in Arizona, for instance, they took a little bit different process with some a different, rather than face-to-face, they did more iterative survey work to get ideas and get their group together. But still, they've got a couple of spin-off groups. They've developed a water app, both in Pennsylvania and Nebraska. There's lots of continuing groups going on, lots of issues being discussed. And so all of this has been very productive in terms of the outcomes. But again, it took the trust to kind of grease the wheels for all of this to happen. And then it goes back into that personal and institutional. If this is a positive experience, it's going to make it even easier for them to come back to the table. Okay, Walt?
Thank you, Cheryl. And we've got just a couple of minutes. I'm going to want to share this with you, and then I want to take the last few minutes and have a bit of discussion if we can. I mentioned the guidebook that we're putting together on the basis of all of this after all our data is collected and coded and reflective, and all of those things are done. We are going to put this together in a guidebook, in addition to the papers and things that Wes mentioned. And this is basically, for frontline practitioners and researchers who are looking to initiate and better understand the processes that they're working with, particularly in working landscapes or natural resources. And you can see those major components that we're looking at: community-led, the process concepts, some of which we teased out. Much of this we just barely skimmed the surface of today, obviously. But there's a deep and rich experience and literature and data behind all of the things that we've been doing in these last 4 years. And you can see these pieces. And I have one last Mentimeter, but I don't want to take time to do that right quite yet, because I'd like to provide you with an opportunity to weigh in or ask questions about either what Cheryl shared or the stuff that I shared with knowledge co-production, or any of this for that matter. And again, you can put those in either the chat or just hit your mic, whatever works for you. I think we're at the end of our day, so we're all exhausted. Let me, and I put this in the chat, as we leave today. First of all, thank you all for joining us and sort of hanging through the technical difficulties that we had. I put this Mentimeter in the chat. That appreciate it. What we're asking essentially is, what additional information or resources would you find useful in this broad category of stakeholder engagement? We teased the literature. You've seen how we've approached this, but I'm sure through your experiences and questions and research and study and practice, that you have also plenty of, we could spend an hour talking about all of this stuff, just our own personal experiences with everyone that's on the call. This is a way to at least capture that initially. So if you can weigh in there, and here is all this will be available, of course, but here is our website, and there is my contact information, and I can put you in touch with Wes or Cheryl or anybody else on this team. So if you would weigh in there as best you can. And then if you have additional questions or thoughts before we part ways and go to the next, our next session, that would be great.
Is it unhelpful if we mark 10 for all of them? Because I can rank them if you'd rather. But
No, it's not unhelpful, because they're all important, right?
yeah, okay then.
And all of us, I'm sure everyone on this call has the same experience as the rest of us, is every time we do this, or every time we study it or try to evaluate, we learn something new, right? So that sort of collective opportunity I would like over time to see us build a bit of a community engagement, community of practice that's more purposeful, because as well, you saw from the list that Wes shared, the increase in the literature, well, obviously it's a growing part of practice. How can we better take advantage of all of these kinds of things to improve the way we do the work we do? And I haven't been able to look.
Thank you all very much. Cheryl, I need to make a trip to Nebraska.
You should.
Sounds good.
Let me see if I can pull this up quickly.
Walt, you're cutting into our wine time.
Yes, I am. I will share I will post the results of this with the slideshow, and all this will be available to you all. Thank you. Don't hesitate to give a shout